pre-rigged flour sack character. And you can actually, he's linked right here. I'll show you how to use the file in a second. But basically, you're going to create some kind of environment with an obstacle or a gap that the flour sack character must jump over or interact with in some other way. Minimum requirements for this, it should be anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds long. If you want to go longer, you're welcome to. Do use the provided flour sack rig. Also, please put some kind of halfway decent texture on the flour sack guy. It's always really bland to just have like a gray sack running through a scene. And then also there should be some kind of, again, story or motivation being communicated. It's sort of like an extension in my mind of the race, where it's like, oh, the characters should have clear motivation and like clear goals. The same thing could be said for this little sack character. Generic things to earn more points, like do nice texturing, lighting, and environment things. And again, try to emphasize as much as you can a sort of life and personality in the sack and get the motion as realistic as possible. So that includes things like make sure that it feels like it's falling at the right speed if you're going to have him jumping. If you do have some kind of jump, have wind up to it, like maybe have the sack squish down a little bit before jumping, all that kind of stuff. And then this assignment is just also sort of good to see if you hate working with rigs before you officially commit to using them for your final. So you will be starting modeling things for your final, and this is sort of like the time when you want to figure out if you want to animate all your characters with deformers and grouping or with a rig. So just kind of like bear that in mind while you're doing this assignment and like working with the rigs and that kind of stuff. Any questions on that? All right. So I tweaked the guidelines for assignments slightly for this one, which I guess is like the last weekly one. Does that math work? Yes, good. Okay. But yeah, so I swapped originality to sort of project ambition and originality. So that's basically like, is your idea original? That's part of it still. But have you gone sort of above and beyond to try to do something a little bit more challenging with your scene? Or have you done sort of like the bare minimum required to do the assignment, if that makes sense? So that's kind of like basically what that is just, I guess, how complex was the idea that you tried to tackle, or have you, instead of just doing like a really generic like walk cycle where the guy just sort of like walks straight and like jumps over a thing, have you tried to give him, some kind of other motion? Is he running, fleeing in terror, or does he have a little limp or something like that? Apart from that, like model quality, texture quality, lighting are all pretty much the same. And then animation quality, I'm looking for realism of the motion, and then also, again, do the characters have life and personality? It should probably be a little bit easier to get life and personality because you have a rig and more control over the individual parts of the model, instead of just being like, I can bend like half of this in a perfect arc. So that's pretty much this. And then for the submission, pretty much just a video following, again, the standard guidelines like you've been submitting this entire time. I've also decided to get rid of the reference requirement. I might tack that on as some kind of like small bonus, where if you have reference that makes sense with your animation, that could like get you some extra points for like actually looking at reference. But I noticed that it seems like a lot of the times when I ask for reference, either people just wouldn't submit it at all, or it would just be sort of like really random and not super pertinent to the animation. So I decided to just sort of get rid of that as a requirement. But that's basically the flour sack assignment. Are there any questions on that? All right. So I promised you guys a flour sack rig demo. If I can find where I put it. All right, so this is the flour sack rig. You should be able to pretty much just drag the whole thing into Maya and have him exist there. If you look at, all right, Can you all see like the, I guess, layer editor and stuff? So if you guys need to select the geometry for the flour sack himself, there are in your channel box some layers with, like this one you can see geo is for the geometry. It's currently set to reference, so I can't select this. So I'll just turn that off, grab the flour sack rig. This is pretty much like what his geometry looks like. He looks more or less the same, just kind of cubey, unsmooth. And he should be set up with reasonably decent UVs. So it should make him easy to texture. So this is like the front of your flour sack, and this is going to be the back. I would recommend not playing with the UVs. It's going to just make your life a little bit harder, or could potentially break the rig, because some of the stuff for rigging is like pseudo-dependent on the UVs. So for simplicity's sake, I would just leave these, but they're set up so it should make it relatively easy to texture. Apart from that, so I'm just going to set that back to reference so I don't accidentally select it. You can, if you want, turn your controls on and off. So all of these ridiculous multicolored little NURBS curves everywhere are the controls for your rig. So you can just turn them on or off, or if you want, set them so that you can't actually select them, which seems kind of silly. But basically, if you want to just move your rig around and like position it initially in the scene, you're going to grab this ginormous controller with like arrows sticking out of it and move that around, rotate it. You can scale it if you need it to be, okay, you can't scale it, don't scale that. This is, I'm not going to lie, this rig is like the same one that I used 5 or 6 years ago when I did this assignment. And it is fairly robust, but like scaling it, again, doesn't do great things. But yeah, so this like giant arrow controller is not how you're going to actually move your guy if you want him like running. It's literally only for positioning him when you first put them in the scene. So if you needed them to like start on a chair or something like that, you would use this controller to move them. Apart from that, it's kind of just like grab some controls and like play around and see what they do. So in this case, you can see that this sort of skateboard, snowboard shaped controller on the bottom moves the actual body of the flour sack. And it's actually leaving his legs behind, and that is a functionality that was designed into the rig, and it makes it a little bit easier. So imagine if you're animating a walk cycle with like a human person. If you move the hip if when you move the hip forward, it takes the leg forward with it, it's going to get really difficult to make the foot look like it's staying in place on the ground. So actually having these legs stay behind like this is going to make your life easier when animating. Questionable. Because you don't need to like sort of counter key against the motion of the body. It's been a while since I played with this. It's a little bit strange. So as long as you're not like doing anything like super crazy with this, you can see that like when you move this controller here, it'll kind of like move and rotate the legs and have like fairly reasonable deformations throughout the rest of the body. This little sort of circular controller attached on top of that is just for rotation. It's not really for movement. So if you need to like actually move the foot in space, grab the larger controller on the bottom. If you grab these like large circular ones around the inside, you got some squash and stretch built into this rig. So it can be cute, again, for like jumping or doing anything like that. You can stretch him very aggressively if you're so inclined. You can actually probably turn this into a lumpy piece of taffy if you wanted to, but anywho. You also have controllers for the little flaps on the top of the head, so you can wiggle those back and forth. You can stretch them if you need to. I would usually avoid stretching them like super crazily like this, because it just doesn't tend to look terribly natural. It'll also produce pretty aggressive texture stretching if you have like a texture with a noticeable pattern on it. And then these like little floating controllers on the sides. If you guys have watched the recorded lecture from last week, you'll notice that they have some custom setup attributes on the side. So if you need to like just sort of curl the ear up and down, and you don't want to do the individual controllers, you can use those to do that as well. apart from that, you have some sort of like hip controllers, I guess. But really, this is like a lot of just sort of grab the rig, play around with like how things work and how things squash and stretch and deform this little dude, and kind of see what you can do with it. Yeah, there's like 8,000 different ways to rig a character, and everyone just sort of has their own way to do it. But yeah, that's pretty much that. Anyone have any just like questions about how this works, or like any questions on the rig itself? All right. In that case, other thing that you guys have to do, so that's the SAC assignment, and that is actually the last weekly assignment of the quarter. Huzzah! Everything after that is basically just working on the final until the final. So do begin also modeling for your final this week. So that is going to be basically block in something usable for each of your main characters and like major pieces of environment. And when I say usable, so I mean if you're going to deform an object, which you should be using some kind of either rig or like deformers to add some squash and stretch or like bend life to your characters. If the topology is like super wonky and terrifying, it's going to make that very, very difficult to actually deform it and get nice looking, like smooth looking twists and transitions. So I'd rather see something simpler and like mostly done that's usable instead of something that's just sort of been like thrown together to look pretty, but you're going to have to redo, because that's just sort of a waste of everyone's time. So again, minimum requirements are something usable for each main character and major pieces of the environment. I'm ideally would be expecting something pretty much more or less finish your main characters, since you'll be starting to either rig or deform them shortly, and then you're also going to be working with animating them. And then if you can sort of throw in something for like a quarter of your scene, I think that would set you up in a nice place to just be able to sort of like keep working at a leisurely pace for the rest of your assets and stuff like that. And I'm just sort of expecting things to be like more finished than just sort of basic geometry. So just like blocking in everything with super basic like cubes for books and stuff like that is just going to get you like not many points for this assignment. And again, if you're so inclined and you want to start like rigging your main characters, might not be a bad idea to play with that so you can sort of troubleshoot issues, because usually if you've never rigged before, you're probably going to encounter issues. Because you will be starting to do some light animation with them and like animatics and stuff like that next week. So basically what I'm grading you guys on is half the points are for character model, shape, and topology. So I'm looking for the character, or like your characters actually representing and looking like what they should, and then how decent is the topology for actually animating things. So you want to avoid things like enormous stars in the middle of your model, or like 6 edges intersecting in one point is basically like a giant star, or really, really long stretched out geometry that's sort of making really obvious pulls in the model. Because if that's obvious when the model isn't being bent, it's going to be super obvious when you start bending it, and it might cause some like weird clipping issues and stuff like that. Other half of the grade is just quality and quantity of environment models that have been made. So that's pretty much that. And then for what to submit, if you could just throw everything into a single Maya scene with everything like labeled appropriately and unhidden. So if I look in your scene, I don't want to see a bunch of like weird extra stuff I shouldn't be looking at, and I don't want to have to pick through your outliner and sort of like randomly hide and unhide things. If I am not supposed to look at it, either just get rid of it or hide it. And if I should be looking at something, make sure that that is unhidden and, you know, labeled in some way where I can tell like what's your character, what's your environment, that kind of thing. That's pretty much the modeling bit. Are there any questions on that? All right. And just for the record, so I don't know if this has been, if you guys have like actually looked through the point breakdowns for the final, but I do just want to point out that the way I've weighted all of the points, so here are the points for the actual like final project that you're submitting. It's worth as much as a weekly assignment. So there's no sort of magical thing where like your final is worth 40% of your grade, and like if you haven't been keeping up with the weekly assignments or something, it's going to like magically sort of offset other assignments not being done. So what I've actually done is like more so when you get into like lighting and texturing and stuff like that, but the final and all related assignments are still worth about 40% of your grade. But like 30 of those 40 points are the sort of weekly assignments for like your animatic, like beginning modeling. And that's sort of designed to keep you guys on track, because I do notice a lot of times at the final, people just sort of don't submit a lot of the in-progress assignments, and then they throw everything together at the end. So I did just want to point that out. So please do work on the individual final parts, like on the week they're due, or it could seriously impact your grade. Because again, the actual final you're submitting, week 11, is pretty much going to be graded like a standard weekly assignment. So yeah, that's pretty much that. Are there any like questions about that? All right, cool. So if that's the case, cool. Since it was such a really fast